Okay, let's talk about cannabis. Is it a miracle medicine, a dangerous substance? The debate is everywhere, and it is loud. But what does the actual science say? Today, we're going to cut through all that noise and go straight to the source, a massive 2017 report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So let's get into it. So to really understand the health questions, we first have to get a feel for just how fast the ground is shifting under our feet. Back in the 1970s, a few states started to decriminalize cannabis. Then, boom, a huge leap in 1996. California becomes the first state to legalize it for medical use. Fast forward to 2012, and Colorado and Washington legalize it for recreational use. And by the time this report even came out in 2017, medical cannabis was already legal in 28 states plus DC. Policy is just moving at lightning speed, and science is really struggling to keep up. And we're not talking about a niche issue here. Check out this number, 22.2 million. That's how many Americans aged 12 and up said they used cannabis in the past month back in a 2015 survey. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Florida. This massive scale is exactly why getting the health facts straight is so incredibly urgent.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with this rapidly changing landscape. Then we'll dive into the science of how cannabis actually affects you. We'll look at the evidence for its therapeutic benefits and for its health risks. And then finally, we'll talk about what science still doesn't know, and more importantly, why.
Okay, first things first. Before we can even start talking about risks or benefits, we need a super quick primer on the science. Like, what is actually happening in your body when someone uses cannabis? Well, the magic, or, the trouble, it all comes down to these things called cannabinoids. These are the active chemical compounds that interact with specific receptors that are already in our bodies. Think of it like a set of keys that are designed to fit into very specific biological locks. They can come from the cannabis plant itself, or they can be made synthetically in a lab. Now, the most famous of all of these is, of course, THC. This is the main psychoactive cannabinoid. So when you hear people talking about the high or that feeling of euphoria from cannabis, what they're really talking about are the effects of THC. It is the primary intoxicating ingredient. But there is another major player in the game, CBD. And the key thing to understand here is absolutely crucial. CBD is non-psychoactive. It does not produce that intoxicating high that THC does, which is exactly why it's being studied for a completely different set of therapeutic uses. So let's just put them side by side to make this crystal clear. THC is psychoactive. It's what creates the high by binding really strongly to certain receptors in our brain. CBD, on the other hand, is non-intoxicating. It doesn't create a high and can actually, get this, change or kind of modulate some of THC's effects. They are two totally different compounds from the same exact plant, and they have very different effects on your body. Okay, with that basic science down, let's open up the ledger and start with a plus column. Let's look at the evidence for benefits. Where has science actually shown that cannabis or cannabinoids can be an effective treatment? Now, this is a direct, powerful conclusion from that National Academies report. It is one of the most significant findings. The evidence here is so strong that the committee could state pretty definitively that for adults with chronic pain, cannabis can provide a real, measurable reduction in their symptoms. And this table here, it really clarifies where the evidence stands for other conditions. The report actually ranks the strength of the evidence. So for treating chronic pain, the evidence is substantial. For nausea and vomiting caused by chemotherapy, it's even stronger. The report calls it conclusive that oral cannabinoids are effective. And for treating muscle spasticity and multiple sclerosis, there's moderate evidence of improvement. So the key point here is these are the areas with the most solid scientific backing. So that's one side of the ledger, and it's a powerful case for therapeutic potential, for sure. But, to have a real honest conversation about this, we have to turn the page and look at the other side. What does the evidence say about the risks? All right, let's move to the other side of our ledger and focus on the health risks that have been documented in association with cannabis use. So using that very same standard of evidence, the report found substantial evidence for a few key risks. This includes a higher risk of developing problem cannabis use, and that's especially true for people who start young. There's also substantial evidence that using cannabis before driving increases your risk of a car crash. And this one is important. There is moderate evidence of a link between cannabis use and developing schizophrenia, especially in individuals who are already vulnerable. This is likely because heavy use during those critical teen years can mess with brain development. This chart right here just visualizes that risk of problem use. And the data is really clear. The younger someone starts using cannabis, the higher their risk of developing a cannabis use disorder down the road. This connection to adolescent use is honestly one of the most consistent findings in the entire report.
Now, beyond those top-line risks, the report identified other serious areas of concern. These include things like impaired learning, memory, and attention. For people who smoke it chronically, there's a link to worse respiratory symptoms like chronic bronchitis. In states where cannabis is legal, there's been a really troubling increase in accidental overdose injuries in children. And yes, there is a real, distinct withdrawal syndrome, with symptoms like restlessness, irritability, and insomnia.
Okay, so after looking at both sides of the ledger, you might be thinking, wait a second, for something this widely used, why does so much of the evidence still sound kind of limited or moderate? Why don't we just know more? Well, there is a very specific and a very big reason for that. And here it is. This is the single biggest barrier to cannabis research in the United States. At the federal level, cannabis is classified as a Schedule I drug. That is the most restrictive category possible. It puts cannabis right alongside drugs like heroin and LSD, and it declares it has no currently accepted medical use. And this classification, it just creates a cascade of problems for scientists. First, the regulatory hurdles are immense, making it incredibly difficult to even get permission to study the plant. Second, for decades, researchers were limited to a single federal supplier, whose product often didn't even match what's available to the public. And third, this lack of standards makes it nearly impossible to study the huge variety of products people are actually using today. You know, all the edibles and oils and vapes.
And this is the report's stark warning. The science just can't keep up with policy and public use. And that gap, the gap between what we know and what people are actually doing, is in itself a risk to public health. People are out there making decisions without the information they need.
So what's the solution? Well, the report calls for a pretty clear path forward. It says we need to create a national research agenda, we need to improve public health surveillance to track what's happening, and crucially, we have to address the regulatory barriers that have created this fog of science in the first place.
And that leaves us with the central dilemma, doesn't it? Laws are changing, products are evolving, and millions of people are using cannabis every single day. But the science, it's tied down by policy, struggling to catch up. So the real question for all of us, for patients, for doctors, for policymakers, for the public, is how do we navigate this new landscape and make the best possible decisions while we're still surrounded by so much scientific uncertainty?